So our next talk will be a joint presentation. Brian Inglis is a senior lecturer at Middlesex University in London. His interests encompass composition, musicology, and criticism. And Brian's music has been heard at numerous music festivals, both in the UK and abroad, and has been released on Atomic Duster Records, Non-Classical, and Sargasso. Writing projects include articles and criticism for Tempo and M Magazine, and notes and profiles for the BBC. Musicological interests centre around issues of genre and identity, and include publications for Routledge, Peter Lang, and Cambridge Scholars. Our other speaker is, of course, Richard McGregor. He probably doesn't need a big introduction, but for those of you who don't know him, Richard is Emeritus Professor of Music at the University of Cumbria and part-time lecturer at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. He is, of course, best known for his research and analytical work on the music of Max, and he's published 2 books on Max's music and written a number of major articles on his works. And Brian and Richard's topic today is religion, anti-religion, and spirituality. Now, of course, Max was completely fascinated with religion throughout his life, and he once described it as a wonderful work of art. Brian and Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Nicholas. So I'll kick off, if I may, Richard, while you set up the PowerPoint and the screen share.
That's working. Sorry, is that just?
Yes, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah,
so just following on from that great introduction, thank you. I should say that in this august company, particularly, I'm no expert on Peter Maxwell Davies, but I have a growing interest in the area of music and spirituality, and I've published a couple of book chapters in this area recently. One of which alludes to Peter Maxwell Davies and Ave Maris Stella in the context of mystical spirituality and compositional process. I've also written briefly on Peter Maxwell Davies's The Medium in the context of unaccompanied monodrama. So very much looking forward to talking to Richard in this context. So as you see, he's prepared a PowerPoint, and he's also going to share some entries from Max's diaries, which I think is their first public airing, so this is going to be quite a special treat. Richard's been going through these very extensively recently, in part as preparation for this session. So we'll, as you know, we'll be exploring aspects of Maxwell Davies's life and work which haven't been explored a huge amount in the literature so far, so hopefully this is the start of something very new and exciting. And so my role is to pose 4 broad questions, headings, topics, provocations, if you like, just to structure the wealth of material that Richard has prepared for us. So, as Nicholas said, Davies wasn't conventionally religious, certainly in terms of practice, but his work is suffused with religious imagery and spiritual connotations. In fact, it seems almost to have been an obsession for and with him at times. So my first question then, Richard, is, this is manifested through things like use of religious sacred imagery, topics, texts and titles. What drew Max to these? How do spiritual and religious themes feature in his career trajectory? And how did his interest in and concern with these areas change over time?
Okay, so that's a big question to start with, Ryan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a number of sort of summary slides which look at different aspects of it, just so you can get a picture of it. Lots of the things on these slides will be familiar to you. You perhaps won't have known the images, and the one that I'm showing at the moment for the introduction, we'll come back to later on, that circle with the cross in it, because that seems to have been an image which somehow or other created a kind of connection in his mind. But I'll just go on and keep going, and when we'll come back. This is 2 quotes, really. One is at the top. It's not sung in the Pavan number 2, but it's actually there. And it's something that Max goes back to quite a lot. He quotes it in another occasion in a slightly different form, but it clearly was an important one to him. 1968 that dates from. And then in talking to Richard Dufalo, he talks about why he doesn't like organised religion, and that's just a small extract from what he says at that point, and you can see that it's from Tracking. So if you want to have a look at the bigger one, then have a look at go and find that particular interview. So there's a lot of major works which don't have any commentary at all, and you'll notice that they're kind of grouped. There's the ones that begin his career, so the very early one, which I don't think is published yet, and then 5 motets, which obviously, and then that was for voices, and then the instruments were added, and of course, O Magnum Mysterium, and so on. And then I put in Ecce Manis Tridentis. I'm going to come back to that shortly, because that's an interesting one in terms of how it relates to the later works of the 60s. And you'll see that there's nothing really that you could say that has the religious connotation until we get to the Hymn to the Word of God, and then everything else is really more of I think was a commission from various places. I've put some of them in, but not all of them. Just a little quote at the side there from Selected Writings, which is relevant to why they would commission Max when he didn't believe, or supposedly. At the top, the drawing at the top is from Blind Man's Buff, but I put it in there because it's got OMM, which is, of course, O Magnum Mysterium, and IS, which is Igor Stravinsky. And my contention was that this Blind Man's Buff was a kind of realization of the canon in memoriam at Igor Stravinsky. Then there's these major works with some kind of symbolic meaning. So St. Michael, which has Dies Irae, among other things. A very interesting work, which I'd like to pursue a bit more, which is Notre Dame des Fleurs, actually could be related to a French novel about homosexuality. But on the face of it, the story doesn't reflect that, the story of the 6 minute work. But it's certainly something that would be worth investigating. From Stone to Thorn, one of his first major works after starting to move to Orkney, and the first influence really of George Mackay Brown. Blind Man's Buff I've just mentioned, and then the other ones. I've put Roma Amor in, not because it's really particularly religious, but because actually he was so taken with Rome that is really Rome love is so he has reference to churches and so on. So it's clearly quite a symbolic meaning for him, that one. And the ones which contain some kind of commentary, Ecce Manis Tridentis, I did mention, that's the from Luke 22, where the betrayal aspect, Revelation 4, of course, the nun, Hymnos, Antichrist, Missa Super Lomame, again with a nun, and so on. So, but you notice that by the time when we get to resurrection, it's like he wrote it out. And I just put Commilitonin in because he refers back to the text that he used in Ecce Manis Tridentis and in Missa Super Lomame. And again, it's at the risk of sort of making this very small summary of the main ideas here of the various works. For example, Ecce Manis Tridentis is a betrayal, so is Missa Super Lomame. It's the same text. So, but there are, of course, other aspects to it. But he always said he was never consciously trying to make fun of the church. What he was doing was making commentary on aspects of it. So, just before we get to discussing a little bit more of this, these are some of the early diary entries, which and going right through to 1960. Now, I'm not going to read them all. This will be available afterwards. But I think one of the interesting ones is back in diary number 3. He writes, "I hate church. I like God." And I think you could probably say that summarizes his whole outlook from then onwards. There are some interesting ones about why he thinks he likes. And the one I think is interesting is the 1955 one. I write, because I'm created anew in each work, and each renewal is satisfactory when one has, and he writes hopes of and then scores it out, ambition to eventually being created perfect. And he writes a star, and at the bottom of the page he writes exactly that, in God's likeness, question mark. So, and then there's the mystic symbolism and so on. He had some symbolic ideas. So AG, which of course we would immediately recognise as Alexander Goer. JT was somebody he met, and a number of things, but we would recognise it as John Taverner. But he doesn't, even although in the diary he writes earlier on about this person, and he also writes about the Taverner opera, that he's going to start it. He even then writes sometime later that he doesn't understand the significance of this JT cipher. So he's got these ideas, these themes that run through his work all the way through. I've missed a bit now because I want then to bring Brian back in again. I've deliberately not taken us forward into the 60s period because we're going to actually get there in a minute.
Sure. Thank you, Richard, for handing the baton back to me. So if we talk now about David's interest in the use of plain chant, the texts, melodies and meanings, which is a very strong feature of his work. Why plain chant? Did this arise from his medievalist interests and period? And what about the spiritual and religious implications of these text melodies? I'm thinking of Griffiths' quote about Davis always working with the view that the statement of a chant melody comes with it implicitly the statement of its text. And so to edit and distort such a melody must be to explore religious truths.
Well, according to Davis, and I've not found anything contrary to it, he actually listened to plain chant for the first time properly in Rome in 1957. I don't know whether he had encountered it as such, except, of course, that you'll know that I contend that he had the Historical Anthology of Music, which has plain chant in it. So, I mean, he will have been aware of it, but perhaps this is his first opportunity to hear it sung and so on in context. And I'm not entirely sure that he at that point was so taken with the idea of putting meaning of the plain chant into it, except of course the Dies Irae in St. Michael. But I think as he eventually started to use it more, he focused on particular plain chants, particularly the ones for Pentecost. And as you know, I've also contended that these maybe had a talismanic quality, Veni Creator Spiritus, in particular Dum Complementar, another one. I think over time he actually chose the plain chants, not necessarily always, but in many cases for a particular reason. So it might be because he started it on a particular day, he would use the plain chant for that day, or because it was related to Easter, he would use the plain chants for Easter. That's quite obvious. But at the same time, he's not necessarily implying a kind of connection with the whole text. Although on his sketches, when he writes out a plain chant, he'll often write out complete the text of in Latin underneath. And then he abstracts from it. So it's quite difficult. I haven't found anything in the diaries to suggest that what he's actually doing is saying, right, I've got this plain chant now. How am I going to symbolically take out the pitches from this? I don't believe it goes that far, but I think that over time he accrued, as I think maybe Peter Owens that first coined the term, a mythology about how this was going about, and then perhaps even believed in his own mythology about how it happens.
Yeah, and we can perhaps come back to that if we have time before the end. So moving on then to, I guess, the more detailed exploration of superstition and belief in Max's life and work. So, for instance, your own quote, Richard, although not professing a Christian faith, Davies has always had some kind of fascination with the mysteries of religious faith and the idea of a creative spirit. Invoked by the plain chants in an almost superstitious way to assist, as it were, in the creation of new music. I think there might be a link here with mystical spirituality, and also this the use of techniques from esoteric philosophy, alchemy, gematria, tarot, obviously magic squares, and we can come on to that. So these techniques are shared by some composers associated with the New Complexity, Brian Ferneyhough, James Dillon, but there's a quote from Max talking about him spiking sort of systematic processes of pitch and rhythm, quote, to avoid the invocation of shades, which sounds quite superstitious. What did he actually believe in?
Right. Okay. Well, one of the things which we haven't yet touched on is how difficult he perceived the years between 63 and 73. Thanks to Michael, and it's good that Michael's thing was first, because you begin to see some of the things that were going on at that time. But all the time, there are no diaries for 63 to 73. And Chris Austin talked to Max quite a lot and actually said to Max, why are there no diaries for 63 to 73? And Max said to Chris, because the music says it all. But if you look at the other, when he refers back to those times, he just refers to them as the difficult times or the terrible times or whatever, all kinds of adjectives describing it. So I just want to take us through some of the diary entries that date from this period, because then we'll get to the point where we can talk about this superstition. The first one I find rather interesting, in the sense that he's already talking about like the kind of Janus aspect, the spirit of God with the dark face, the devil sort of in it. Occasionally I thought I came to terms with my own isolation. It would be convenient to equate this with a mission in life, the spirit of God or something, but this is only part of it. There's also a dark face, the devil in it. And you can see in 1961, he also writes, we must love traitors, for betrayal is inevitable. The next diary is back to this loneliness. The reference is to Christofson, but then it appears that World's Bliss, which he started, as you can see, in Adelaide when he was there, it has some kind of symbolic and autobiographical significance for him. Actually, in many ways, everything he writes has some kind of autobiographical reference. But in the terms of this whole thing about spirituality, if you look at the bottom quote, I'll take only a little bit of it, the shattering upheaval which broke through the veneer of my attempts to interpret sound images in terms of Christ, the Virgin Mary, etc., and forced me to take account of the Antichrist in myself, resulting in years of darkness from which Hymnos, Revelation and Fall, L'Homme Armé, and probably, though late, World's Bliss were the eventual surface manifestations, as well as the opera. Funnily enough, he doesn't mention Antichrist, which is strange. You'll notice, if you see the rest of the quote, that he talks about the whitening light, which of course is a reference to Mercury, as we'll see in a minute, but also a work subsequently called by that same title. Okay, so what was it that he did? Brian has already quoted this idea about the spiking of, it was in the Lighthouse that he did that, but he also talks about having done the same in Resurrection. And then later in writings you can find a reference to prolation, but again, this is written in 2006, so a long time after he did that. But it's the same thing, to attempt any imitation of higher natural perfection is somehow dangerous. So I'll move on. He talks about the four elements in a letter to Gerald McBurney, and then there are some kind of diary entries which support the idea that he had some kind of feeling for the superstitious or the supranormal. I didn't want to call it any other way, just not beyond the normal was what I was looking for. So he looks at things like this halo around the person's head. And by the way, in the diary, because the diaries refer to people, I've omitted any reference to anybody who could still be alive. It's so really we just get and we would continue to do that and the trust would wish us not to refer to anybody in particular. But look at the ways he talks. He talks of St. Magnus was present as clearly as if he were visible by the tomb. And then this idea of, as he was a child, taken to the Lake District, he had this oral vision of music he'd eventually write. He later says, quite precisely, this is 2012, of course, he's writing this World's Bliss. World's Bliss is such an important work in Max's output, in terms of his personality, I think. But this is apparently at Dartington, because he was there in the 70s. Apparently, it was said that every time he started a new work, he sacrificed a chicken. And somebody at Dartington, actually a local, I believe it was a local, came up to him and asked him if he was in fact the devil. This is probably because he wrote the music for the Devils at that time for Ken Russell's film. But what I find is interesting is that this quote, which I'll not do in detail, but you can have a look at afterwards, is actually full of the kind of what we would want to understand about Max's understandings, his understandings of the relationship between Mercurius, alchemy, and so on. It's quite an interesting one, and I'll leave you to look at that when we have it online. And finally, this is from, well, the chart is from Ave Maris Stella, but now not available because he gave half of the sketches to Marie Curie. She's now in a home, and when the house was cleared, something happened to these. Fortunately, I photographed all the sketches, despite her saying to me, I'm not sure whether this is good or not. I'm certainly glad I did. But I was in touch with Gillian Whitehead on the basis, because she knows Graham Hare, who is a colleague of mine up in Scotland. And Graham pointed me to the fact that he thought that Gillian was using magic squares before Max. And in fact, I contacted her and she said, yes, it was so. She came with this piece, and she didn't say which one it was, which she'd used magic squares. And he said to her, quote, "You've even made me think." But she couldn't date that exactly for me as to when that happened. But Max obviously had some kind of connection, or felt some kind of connection with the Virgin Mary in some kind of way, because of the 8th being the same date. And what's not so well known now, but is becoming well known, is that actually Max was adopted. And he, in some way, he thought himself always an outsider. And that's possibly why he linked himself into some kind of symbolic idea about Mary and so on. Brian.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, so I mean, we're almost at the end, and you've sort of partly preempted my final broad question, which is about magic squares, and so there's the source of that usage from his pupil Gillian Whitehead, the New Zealand composer. I was just wondering, I mean, they're often linked in the literature with sort of serialism, integral serialism, that type of manipulation, but also there's the strong sense of esoteric tradition, which Max obviously was interested in. I was wondering if you could talk to the sort of relative importance of those two strands. I mean, he clearly did have a strong sense of what was or might be beyond the phenomenal world.
Yes. Now, that takes us right back, if I could, to the very first slide. I did promise I would mention this. That circle with the cross in the middle of it. There's a diary entry from 1973, which I want to quote here, because this is presumably just as or just before he was starting to think about using these squares and so on. He says about composition, "I have learned through the game," he talks composition as a game, for instance, experiencing into this with my most inward being, or that which to date I've been able to recognize as such, that the Annunciation, birth, death, and resurrection are present at every moment, everywhere, and it is only the illusion that they are not that makes life unbearable. And then he continues slightly later on. He talks about it, that one fails to realize the eternal presence of this quaternity, and the other. And then there's a dash, and he goes, Hagia Sophia, that's holy wisdom, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost / Eternal Mother. Dash, the last completing the circle and merging back into the first. Dash, it's a continuum of which one can only become intellectually aware by taking the 4 points, joining them, imagining a circle joining up, linking the cruciform. I think that what appealed to Max about magic squares was the fact that they, if you know his earlier works, that the amount of material he had to produce in order to do transformation squares and in order to create, so he had transformation squares for one idea changing to another, and then the same idea changing to something else, and then that second idea. There's all sorts of, he actually had to generate so much material that I think what he found in the magic squares is a kind of, almost a shortcut to the patterning, and that the patterning became important to him because he could then see a connection between this quote that I've just said, this idea that the patterns that are created have some kind of almost talismanic quality that he was able to tap into. I think it's interesting, though, that he didn't always feel he had to do that. And if we go back to Salome, which is in 1978, although he created a magic square for it, he ran out of time. And so he just actually began to freehand write, as far as I can tell. And in his script underneath, he writes that he hasn't got any time, that he has to just do whatever happens. That's a sort of summary of what he says. But basically, he had, when he had the time, he would actually make some kind of symbolic significance. This is why the autobiographical thing is really important, because he has, for example, his partner, Metin, he has the Metin square. So it becomes part of of building in his life into the work.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, and just to wrap up then, sort of coming back to where we started in our conversations where we prepared for this session, you mentioned that during the 60s and 70s there was a lot of very inward-looking stuff in both his life and his work. And then once he got that out of his system, he became more concerned with moral and environmental issues. So a more outward-looking approach, and obviously community work. So that's I think that's a nice way to round it up. If that's appropriate, Nicholas?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. I wonder if you could just come off your screen share.
Yes, I'm getting there. Sorry.
Okay. That's okay.
You could probably stop me.
I'll just crack on then, Richard, as you're doing that.
I've done it.
There you go. There you go. Wonderful. So what I'm going to do now, as chair of this session, I'm going to ask one question both to Richard and another question to Michael, and then what I'll do then is obviously open the floor for any other questions that any of you might have. So Richard, as you've delivered that talk, I'll start with you if that's okay. My question is as follows. I mean, your talk really highlights the fact and underlines the fact that Max had certain obsessions throughout his life, most definitely, and these are really intimately bound up with symbolism. And one of the things that struck me about your talk is when you mentioned Roma Amor, Rome as a symbolic. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I think you probably know more about Roma more than I do. I think that he spent a lot of time in Rome, one way and another, and had friends there. So I think that the piece actually reflects some of his happier moments, and the idea that somehow, I can't really put it into words, but I think maybe he kind of felt Rome was like home. I know he had home out in the islands, but in terms of the social mix and the way in which he was able to relax in Rome, I just think that that's again is a very much an autobiographical piece in that sense. And I think until we can unpick these how it's autobiographical in the broadest sense, I think we won't really understand the piece completely.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that Max had particular places which associated with different things, and certainly Rome was a happy place for him. And maybe, Sylvia, in a moment you could talk a little bit more about the significance of Rome. But let's move on to Michael. Michael, I mean, just to reiterate, what a wonderful talk that was, packed full of so much information. It really is a kind of a treasure trove, isn't it, that archive for people working on not only Max but other composers. I really like that final slide, which just at the top it said academics are overpaid, which it might have been true then, but it's possibly not now. That amused me greatly. I was.
Well, they're overpaid compared to poets, I guess.
Yeah, well, fair enough. It's a steady income, isn't it, as opposed to poets, perhaps. I was fascinated between the relationship between Sculthorpe and Max at that time, because I always thought that, you know, they had this very amenable relationship. So why was Max so against Sculthorpe's piece? Was it simply a matter that the piece, he didn't like it, he didn't think it was worthy of performance by the Fires? Is there something deeper in this that we should look for, or is it just superficial?
I don't know, and it's a bit odd, and all the correspondence around it makes it sound like it just shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have been his choice. He didn't have to make that complaint. It's an ISCM festival. They brought the group in. Here's the music to play. Not really the moment where the group gets to choose some and reject others. So no, I mean, it's a bit strange, and it's because that there's a kind of slightly larger version of that anecdote in my book. I did go and try and find more correspondence to make better sense of it, and quite quickly people just feel awkward about it, and so there is no real explanation. And certainly the correspondence that's coming from Peter Sculthorpe through his secretary is all very amenable and all very, there might be some disagreement, but it's not really the right piece anyway, and it would have been better if they played something else. Someone else has made a mistake, and it's really no problem. Because I agree, everything else suggests that they got on very well in 1965, and that kind of goodwill existed and continued and was really no problem. So I'm afraid I can't tell you more.
No, it's fascinating though, isn't it? Great. What I'll do then, I'll open the floor for questions. So just give me a little wave, or if you wanted to ask a question. Maybe Sylvia, could you tell us a little bit about Max and Rome and his happy place?
Sure, definitely happy place. And it goes right back to when he was studying with Petrassi, where his great friend, Giuseppe Rebecchini, was interested in contemporary music, but he was an architect and he didn't really know how to access it. And so he made himself indispensable to the society where all those performances took place. And that's how he met Max. And that friendship, and with his wife as well, who was also, she's still alive, he isn't, an architect, just went on. I can't be certain that he introduced Max to the churches of Borromini. And at the end of his life, Giuseppe lived in the square well, literally a second's walk from the square where most of those Borromini churches are. However, I think it was he who introduced them. So somehow, I think the Rebecchinis were a lot to do with it being a happy place. I always forget the name of a fellow composer of Max's, who is also a Roman. They studied with Petrassi together. He's still alive too, as far as I know. I'm not sure they were great friends, but it was his mother who was in charge of this society where, for the promotion of new music, she was a friend of Stravinsky and did in fact have the had the manuscript score of Aegon, of which I've only seen copies in this guy's house. It's really ridiculous. I can't remember his name. I should have looked it up before. He's a sort of composer who he's well thought of, I think, in Rome, but I don't think anyone would have heard of him outside Rome. So it goes right back to there. They were always walking around Rome, and hence the story of Roma Amor, which, if I'm thinking of the right piece, is the walk they did through Rome, which Max describes in the piece. So whenever we went at the end of his life, when he wouldn't, as you know, go anywhere on his own, always we stayed with the Rebecchinis. In times of trouble, they used to let Max live in they always had a house in the country, which is now a different one from the one Max stayed in. Giuseppe recounted how Max was determined to get on with his work, and they weren't there at the time. And when they went to see him, there was a sort of break in the field outside where he'd walked around it and made a square from their house around this field, and that was his exercise, because there wasn't anywhere to go. I mean, it was at the end, that one was at the end of a path. The other one, which Chris and I went to after Max had died, was somewhat, but quite a long way away, a couple of hours drive from Rome. And of course, Giuseppe was an architect, it kind of fitted in with all the things. I mean, not just the Borromini of the 10th Symphony story, but it kind of fitted in the things that Max was interested in. For instance, he liked everything Roman, and if we ever went anywhere near the British Museum, there was always that coin shop, which he was difficult to get out of. It seems to me that he had a real feel for everything of that, from the Romans onwards, to do with Italy, and Rome, of course, being the sort of epitome of everything. I mean, he liked Florence and so on, but it was his favorite place. And then when it was the 10th Symphony, we spent hours walking around. I mean, funnily enough, the one thing he could do still was walk around a lot, even when he was ill. And so we would walk from the Rebecchinis to Jack, whatever his name is, house. Do you know who I mean?
Jack Buckley?
Yes, we'd walk all the way from the Rebecchinis' house to things, stopping A, at churches, and B, at bars, needless to say. Well, you can't walk all that way without some Prosecco, can you? So he was totally at home, because his Italian was good enough to, not necessarily to fool Italians, but there was a wonderful moment when, with the press conference before the 10th Symphony, and there was the guy who was in charge of RAI 3, the classical music station, and the really, I have to say, I think he's still alive, so I'll be careful what I say, but slightly unpleasant man who's in charge, and it was he who would commission, well, he would have given permission to find the money for that half of that commission, and Max and Papano. And Max and Papano started talking about music education and whatever. The other lot didn't get much of a look in, but it was the audible gasp in the audience, all of whom were, 90% of whom were Italian, that Max could hold this conversation, because they really didn't know that. And so, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure he felt at home there all the time, and he did spend a lot of time there. And any time he could, he would go, in the past as well. Though he didn't, travels in the past, as it were dictated by conducting and things like that. But he was definitely happy there. He liked their house and so on.
Thank you for that lovely recollection of Max in Rome, because it doesn't matter what comes out in the music and what we read, having somebody who's with him at that time on all those occasions really does add something else. And you mentioned their music education, and this obviously came up in Michael's talk as well, but Max wrote a lot of music for children, and you played that lovely recording. Can you just remind me who was speaking there? I missed that.
So the person who was speaking, the little audio clip was spoken by Donald Pearce, is his name. He was the founding professor of music at the University of Sydney.
Yes.
And so he founded that in 1954, something like that. And as I say, he was a Renaissance music person, but finds himself in Australia and trying to create a new department. And actually, I think that's also, he and Mellors were kind of close friends for the same reason and for the same commitment to children. And so Davies is the obvious person to ask.
Yes, yeah. Seems to have gone down well. Are there any other questions from anybody? No? Okay.
Too many questions. That's
I was wondering, actually, Michael, it was really interesting to see the financial records in the archive that you shared with us. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to the funding model of the activities that you uncovered. I mean, because you mentioned, quite a lot of activity in publishing and also performances for which there were a lot of rehearsals. And yet you talk about, sort of not quite constituted company structures and making a loss, failure to make a profit. Could you kind of expand on that a bit?
I only to say that it's too complicated for me to understand. So that there are financial records there. They might be complete. They might not be. They're probably not complete. There's clearly a huge amount that's done on the fly. So there are budgets that need to be done when the PRO Players is touring, or when a festival wants them to come. They need to name their price. But it's also quite unclear what the relationships are. I mean, there are moments where it's clear, but it's quite fluid. So even though we're still only talking about 3 or 4 year period, the fact that the larger companies' books don't seem to balance, and then there's £500 or £600 that comes from Max.
I was wondering if they were being bailed out by people like Max who were benefiting or otherwise wanted to support.
It's hard to know whether they're being bailed out or whether that's then payment for more management promotion over the next period.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And the fact that Murdoch had been managing the PRO Players for 18 months or 2 years before realizing that they weren't registered as a business, they weren't incorporated. They didn't have, who has the right to this name? We probably should register the name. Even though the sums of money seem to me quite large, if you're talking over £1,000 for an event, that's a lot of money. Clearly, that didn't necessarily mean that everything was going through an accountant and kind of being organized in that way.
Mm-hmm. And yet, presumably, some of the things would have been eligible for public funding in the UK and possibly also Australia. I don't know about that.
Yeah, and they're applying for Arts Council of England funding, and there's, you know, I think in the year that there's sort of £500 or £600 that comes from Max, there's £35 from the SPNM, and there's other kind of bodies that are giving money, and it's not entirely clear what that money is going towards. So,
Richard,
James Murdoch. It's interesting that it was Birtwistle that wrote to him. Did he and Max stay friendly, or was this tension that was Birtwistle mentioned actually evident between him and Max? And the interesting thing also is that Birtwistle very shortly afterwards cut his ties to the Pierrot players. Did he not?
He did.
So it's not just as simple as it might appear that, you know, Birtwistle didn't like Murdoch, so we get rid of Murdoch.
No, because Murdoch then becomes the manager of the PRO players. Yeah. And that relationship carries on until Murdoch is invited back to Australia, and that all seems fine. Then I don't think there's any correspondence between. I mean, the correspondence that exists between Max and Murdoch is business correspondence. There's no real discussion of, you know, religious symbolism or that kind of thing. And so when Murdoch leaves, that the correspondence doesn't really continue. But there's no sign of hostility there. No.
Well, it's interesting that the reason given for Birtwistle leaving it was because he was finding everything was getting so much more camp. Is there any indication that there's anything between Max and Murdoch?
No, I don't think it's between Max and Murdoch. I think it's between Max and Harry.
Ah, right.
The tension was between Max and Harry.
Right.
But it is interesting that the letter is then you know, saying that Murdoch is causing trouble, or, you know, trouble with the players or something like that.
Max never said. I never heard Max say a bad word about Murdoch, but I mean that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But he used to talk about him, you know, my ex-manager. But really, the tension. I mean, you may be right, and there may have been all sorts of tensions, but the big tension was between Max and Harry, and I don't think it was influenced in any way by Murdoch. That's my impression, anyway.
Okay. That's a can of worms, isn't it? That's
I'm not opening it any further. I could, but I won't. Yeah, I was sworn to secrecy.
Oh, well, that's a tease.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. I think on that note, we'll wrap up for today. So thank you once again for Michael, Brian, and Richard for those wonderful talks. Thank you so much. Absolutely. And thank you to Sylvia, George, Maria, Jonathan, Andrea, and Carl for joining us today. Hopefully you've got something out of the session, and our next section actually is a long way off. It's I've just checked, and it's on the 8th of October. Now, it's a long way off, obviously, but it will soon come around very quickly, I'm sure, as we get past the summer and back into the rhythm of the academic year. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Have a wonderful summer, and stay safe. Keep well, everybody, and we'll see you then. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you.